Hello, and welcome back to Parley, a show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. And this month, PNGRZ has chosen some discussion about quote-unquote useless game systems. PNGRZ says one frame that's particularly fresh in my mind is that people will often call something in a game quote-unquote useless just because there is some other item or ability that does a similar thing and accomplishes a specific goal better, though that gets reductive pretty quickly. But while I do recognize that very often people don't see the myriad ways a given game piece might be employed, there are still times when I still find something in a game that really does leave me scratching my head, like, who is this for? So I'd be interested to hear about some useless game pieces you've come across or times you might have been uncertain why something was around to later find out a good reason to use it. I will conclude with the flavor text of Magic the Gathering's card Null Rod. Gerard says, but it doesn't do anything, to which Hannah replies, no, it does nothing. A glorious piece of flavor text that I was familiar with. Awesome, a really interesting question. Let's get out of the way the thing that you referenced at the start of the video, although it'll come back here and there. This idea that, you know, what's most common, overwhelmingly more common and much less interesting, we're not going to talk about it that much, is that people simply don't know that there is another place where a thing is powerful, or they don't know that they have discarded the context where the thing is commonly powerful. Let me give you a quick example, because I think this is very important to understand. A lot of the time, my experience has actually been that people will verbally actually kind of admit that they know that the thing is good somewhere else, but they just don't notice that they've sort of discarded that context where it's useful. They'll say something like, you know, this is better all the time. This is just way better. This is the best in every way. And then I'll say the obvious way in which it isn't the best. And then they'll say, right, but that doesn't matter. Which is sort of like them saying, I actually know that it's good that way, but that context just isn't important to me, is what they're saying. Do you see what I mean? They're kind of telling you, they might not have noticed that they're doing this, but they've decided in some subconscious way that that context just isn't really relevant, but they didn't do the good philosophy or debate practice of noting that bias or mentioning, like, by the way, when I say this is the best in every way, like, obviously there's this way in which it isn't the best, but I just arbitrarily don't care about that one way, you know? And in fact, again, if you push them, they will often literally just say that, sort of reverse engineered, which is very interesting to me. So again, I think a lot of people react the way I often have in the past. They hear people say something like that and they think, but how is that even possible? Like, there's this obvious way that it is clearly not just literally better. It's important to keep your sanity. They actually kind of know it isn't better in every way. They're just being lazy. They really are just being lazy. They're not like magically incapable of being aware that it's better in that other way. They are just being lazy. Now, could they maybe have kept their opinion to themselves if they were going to just be lazy and oversimplify other people's fun? Yes, but we're not going to get into that too much. Again, that's really all I have to say about that part of the topic. Now, the trouble, of course, is that because people, like 90% of the time, that's what's happening. So what about when the card really is bad? What about when you're playing Magic and you open a pack and you get a 4-mana spell that gains you 7 life? That's just bad, baby. It's bad. There's really no excuse. So now we're going to get into why are there some things that are just bad? Or maybe some of them aren't secretly bad. What's up with that? And then I'll give you some examples of my own experience. Magic the Gathering is a treasure trove of these. There's quite a few things I can think of here. One of them is, we'll just do them in order as much as I can think of them. One of them is that the card is a pitfall or a trap meant to teach newer players. So the life gain cards. For a while, these existed in Magic, and if you played pretty much any card game, a turn-based, you reduce the opponent's life to 0, whatever, card game, you would know that generally if you have a card that gains you health back, but it doesn't solve the thing that was reducing your health, it usually does very close to nothing. You know, you have to really bend over backwards to make it good in any meaningful way. It would be better to remove the source of the threat, or to make a strategy that didn't take as much damage, or that can afford to take more damage, or etc. But these cards were put in by the designer's own admission as a kind of way to teach new players that that was bad. And now, of course, that doesn't work. You'll note that that doesn't really work. I think people have mostly stopped doing this, so we're not going to harp on it too long. But a lot of these are going to be game design fallacies. The developers don't know that a thing is bad, but it's just game design that they don't know is bad. Having a player realize that a life gain spell is bad doesn't make them understand the thing they really need to learn, which is that their life is a resource, that they should just lose a bunch of life. It's going to teach them to preserve their life total, in my experience. Players I've played against at lower skill levels, and a lot of players I've taught, respond to these bad life gain cards by learning that they should overly guard their life total, which is the opposite thing to learn. Your life total is a resource that you can use to gain tempo. We're not going to get into that here. We don't have time. But the idea is not really very functional. It's not good to include cards that trip the player up. Like, the player doesn't need things that ambush them and are bad to be bad. The player will be bad with good cards. Like, don't worry. The new player is still going to be bad. They will learn if they have good cards. They will wonder, why is this effect good? And then find out, oh, like, there actually is a place where that's good. My experience has been that if you give players not overly complicated, but like legitimate decks, legitimately powerful strategies in card games, they often learn better in the medium term because they become a little curious. The deck works, but I don't really understand why this is a good card in here. Or it broadly works, but they're not using a few of the cards because they don't get why they would be good. And that's a way for them to be invited into contextual strengths, which are basically the solution to this whole parlay, right? In Warframe or a game with a ton of different weapons, and you set up builds and you've got builds ready to go, they're just kind of hanging out there. In these games, a lot of the time the solution is that, yeah, this is just very good in a niche, and if you can just keep it on hand, it doesn't really matter that it's not that good elsewhere, as long as the niche is relevant enough and the cost to acquire the item isn't ridiculous enough. It is generally pretty good, whatever that means, which in this context means it's really good when it's good. You just only use it when the conditions or the situation for it apply. Having weapons such that you don't always use them, but you bring them out when you want to, is, perfectly fine for their power level. That gets a little bit into player taste, of course. And we'll get back to that later. But this has brought up another problem, because you can kind of go the opposite way. What about cards or weapons that are just blatantly terrible, except in one kind of gotcha or tricky situation? I personally think these are equally bad. So this would be something like, Magic has a great example. It's called One with Nothing. It's weirdly dark. One with Nothing is a card that makes you discard your whole hand. In Magic generally, this is extremely bad. Like, you lose the game on the spot, bad. But it's very good in a lot of strategies. It's not amazing because there's better variants, and we'll get to that in a minute. But it's, it's good in various strategies. Now, if you've played a lot of build-making systems in games before, you look at a card like One with Nothing, and you've been around the block a few times. You weren't born yesterday. You look at it and go, there will be some weird combo deck where this is really good, and I'm sure this is really, you'll look at it and say, this is really bad. Oh, no, it's probably really good though. It should get you suspicious, thinking like, no, that's so obviously disastrous. There must be a reason why that's secretly really good. And of course there is. In Magic, there's lots of strategies that are interested in that, like maybe Dredge, where a lot of their cards are more valuable to them in the graveyard, as much as if not more than if they're in their hand. Maybe you're going to cast the spells out of the graveyard. Maybe you're going to resurrect a creature that you can't pay the mana cost for in your hand, but you can pay the mana cost for a spell that brings it back to life. Maybe you just want to play Madness cards, which cost less or no mana if you discard them and then pay a cost. You can play them for free or very cheap. So in practice, it can be a good effect, but here's the thing for me. Like, I think this is still really bad because it's such a petty trick. It's such a wasteful piece of design. You're making players learn more little things. If you've ever taught people board games, you do not want to make the player learn any more text or rules or whatever than is necessary. You've made a game piece that the player has to learn about, even though it never matters except when it's obviously good, instead of making a game piece that is functional, but then is better in those strategies. Not only is the resulting game piece probably more balanced, it's more meritorious. Like it makes more sense to have it exist most of the time. For Magic, the example I would give would be Faithless Looting. This is a similarly costed spell in red that makes you draw 2 and discard 2, or discard 2 and draw 2. I always forget the order. This card is like okay in a normal Magic deck. Not amazing, but workable. And is very good, you know, in practice what people use in like those dredge decks, for example. It's a very valid option for those strategies. It's a card that isn't a trick, but it still has a trick. It's interesting because Magic is interesting, not because there's some finicky, specific scenario in which it's powerful. I think a lot of people really like that type of thing. They like it when there's a thing in a game that's just kind of a little trick. I think that there's reasons, mature and immature, to like that. I think it gives you confidence introducing a game, to feel like you have some insider knowledge about it. It reminds you of history in the game. I think in a more negative way, it encourages people to kind of want the game to be inaccessible. It's just sort of incomprehensible. A lot of things in the game are useless unless you know some weird little strategy. Personally, I think if there's anything in the world that you could just tell people one sentence and suddenly they don't need to have experienced a huge amount of learning to catch up, you should just give them that information. Like, that's Wikipedia. If you don't think Wikipedia is good, you are a bad person. And to me, it's kind of a Wikipedia card. It's like, you just look up where this is obviously good somewhere, and then it's over and we go back to work, you know? Why not make cards that are just good anyway? And then you have the delightful surprise of finding like, oh, it has synergy in this strategy, right? You can play cards that are good but get better elsewhere, rather than cards that are terrible and then are amazing in one specific place. Again, I would also argue that this is a very good way to intuitively balance a game. You should do more than intuitively balance a game. But if you want to eyeball it to get it close on the first try, this is a very good practice. Don't make things that are combo food. A really good example, and to give Magic a little more credit, because it's very guilty of doing this badly and actually getting credit for doing it well too. A lot of combos in Magic, whether they were intended or not, are very good examples of this design. A Splinter Twin comes to mind. A lot of the cards in Splinter Twin are perfectly serviceable spells, or very powerful or exciting to various players, but also happen to combo together very well. Obviously, that also adds robustitude to the deck. It's very interesting when a Splinter Twin player will use their Pestermite or Deceiver Exarch to tap down their opponent's stuff and defend themselves while they set up their combo. Isn't that more interesting than a card that just cheesily activates this very specific mechanic and is complete unusable garbage in their booster pack for everybody else? I don't know. That just seems kind of better to me. Maybe that's just me. So that's another category. Again, I think you can go too far and make cards that are good in a way that isn't clear to the player, but it's very gimmicky. It's like only in that one specific way does this really deserve to be a general game piece. Could you not have made this be something that was more broadly useful? Could you not have made this a multitasking game piece? I think a lot of games just indulgently rely on the player being willing to look up or learn endless amounts of information, when that's not terrible, but it is inferior game design to something more crisp, where there's such a ridiculous number of pieces, and those pieces do more things, are more useful. It was shocking to me when I looked up how few cards are in Inscription. It kind of doesn't feel like there are that few cards. Anyway, even in some Magic sets, to be fair, I'm really ragging on Magic. Actually, for this part of the parlay, I want to do something I haven't done before and include a comment from a thread that somebody opened up on PNGRZ Parlay. iPetch Notes, you said, throwing in my piece, the boiled down frustration I have is lack of upgrade paths, which I feel is related to that thing I was just talking about. iPetch Notes says, sometimes game pieces are thrown in with the intention of the player growing out of them. However, said game pieces could have unique functionality even at the highest levels of play, and the player would be fighting against the system to use a past due mechanic. Warframe has both the symptoms and a solution: variance. Most weapons have a theoretical upgrade path via primes, barrow, prisma weapons, nemesises, etc. The rub comes to waiting for said variance, or when those opportunities are already spent. Hello, Gorgon, for example. Yeah, obviously they're not always good. The concept here is great, I think. This is a good thing to add. Patch Notes is alluding to this idea that games might have something bad in them that is only bad in the context of the end game. There's a time when it's good, but not just some specific context for the player who wants to use it. A specific part of the game. Maybe in a game where you progress through the early game, the mid game, the end game, you have less powerful weapons and then you upgrade them later. I think Warframe is a fantastic example for this because it's weird, right? Like, you don't actually need to make weapons that are less powerful in the early game in Warframe because all the damage from weapons comes from mods. So you could give the player really powerful weapons and they just wouldn't do that much damage because they wouldn't have mods on them yet, because the player doesn't have the mods and they're not ranked up. Why the heck does Warframe have Hornet Strike, Serration? These are base damage mods that you rank up over a long period of time. They act as an interesting progression system, except that Warframe also has another progression system that fulfills the exact same goal, but is just more wasteful, which is getting literally better weapons. There's no need for the player to get better weapons because their weapons are already worse just by the fact that they don't have mods. They multiply a weapon's crit to get good damage, but they don't have that mod yet. So they can have a weapon with good crit. They can have good crit chance on a weapon, and it won't be good because they don't have the crit chance mod. This drives me crazy. I think it's nuts. In Warframe, there's this phenomenon where bad things can become like exponentially more powerful over the course of the game because they get moderately better by you getting a better variant of them, and then moderately better again, they don't even need to, by getting, mods added to them, and then they become a world destroying monster compared to what they were before. Now this leads us to the boogeyman of this whole discussion, which is the concept that there needs to be weaker things in these games for things to feel more powerful. My thesis for this part of the parlay is that isn't true. I will try to figure out if I can find a way to explain why people think that's true, but I really don't think that's true. I do not think that's true. Exhibit 1. People don't actually use the weaker things a lot of the time. Many people who say that there need to be weaker things to use the stronger things know what the weaker things are, quote unquote, because the community has told them, like, these weapons are bad. But because they were told that, they didn't use those weapons. And so they haven't used anything but the stronger weapons, and yet they think they are strong weapons. So clearly you don't need to do that. Now, we don't know every single player. I'm just saying I feel like in many cases I've been able to track a person in a few cases in my community that has said there needs to be weaker weapons for there to be stronger weapons. But I know that player to be a player that almost never discusses anything other than the strong weapons. And so it's like, have you used those weaker weapons? I don't know if you needed the weaker weapons for you to feel like there are stronger weapons. I don't know. I personally don't think this is a thing. Exhibit number 2. Many of these games have a progression in power that comes from somewhere other than there being weapons that are just bad. This could be in a mundane way, like how in Warframe there are weapons that are simply the only weapons available at a lower level, meaning, yeah, like they're weaker compared to other weapons that you can't use yet. And so you'll use those, you'll use weaker weapons at an earlier stage of the game, and then you'll be only using powerful weapons, but earlier in your time playing, you have an example of these weaker weapons. Now, not only do I think that this is a good example of how you don't need to have actually bad weapons in the game that serve no purpose other than to be bad, I also think it's a good piece of evidence that players don't need an example of weaker weapons to think weapons are strong, because what do players do when they get to the end of the game? They only use their weapons that are strong. A lot of people do. And so they don't have anymore an example of weaker weapons, and yet they don't think their weapons are weaker over time. Their weapons don't get weaker over time. Another parallel to this example is in a game like Magic. A kind of similar phenomenon exists with Limited. Limited is a way of playing Magic, what Magic calls the activity of opening up product on the spot to make a deck with. So I go to a sealed tournament, open up 6 booster packs, and I get unlimited land to make a 40-card deck out of the cards only in those packs and the land to play a sealed tournament. Pretty fun. Obviously, the decks are going to be largely much lower power. lower pool of cards to pull from, and you're not going to be able to get, exactly the cards that would be great in your deck, right? When you then play a constructed tournament where you bring a deck pre-made of any cards allowed in that format that you choose, and then you sit down with your deck you've already got made, that deck is, broadly more powerful. That might not be necessarily the focus for every player, but you definitely do have at least the opportunity to experience that lower tier of Magic gameplay, which can be really fun. I personally think that the funnest Magic is somewhere between the lowest and highest power levels that are available, which I personally think if you could somehow survey everyone, people would largely agree about most games, not even just games like Magic. So Exhibit 2B, am I using numbers or letters here? I personally feel like you can see that you can make, weaker versions of things available without making things that are actually bad. You just have things that are not as good or applying to a different context. Again, in Warframe, it could be that you'll be able to use that weapon later and it'll be powerful. You'll just get a more powerful variant of it. It would be great if Warframe had you actually use the weaker variant of the weapon to get the stronger variant, and then you didn't have to level it up again and stuff. It just gained polarities. That would be very elegant. It would make players feel like, this weapon is good. Later, you're going to upgrade it, and that upgrade is really powerful. I think that would be very fulfilling. I wish they did that. For various reasons, I guess I understand why they don't, but I don't think it's good. I think it'd be better design if they did. Exhibit Gamma or something, I don't know, 3C. I feel that players don't always actually want the thing to feel powerful. I think they think of it that way, but it's not quite that that's going on. I'm going to try to now paint a picture of why I think people are under the illusion that there needs to be weak weapons for there to be strong weapons, even though they don't even experience the weak weapons, and so that's clearly not true. So what's going on? What do they actually want? What is this thing that they seem to really care about, but that logically it doesn't seem to actually exist? What's going on? What I'm going to offer, before we conclude this parlay with a few examples of my own experience, is that players are experiencing a feeling of security. When they say weaker and stronger weapons, I think what a lot of people mean or are feeling is weapons that I, the player, am aware are not as effective for me as weapons that I, the player, am aware are more effective for me. There's a security and comfort that feels like power. I think that power fantasy as a topic in general is essentially just boiled down to comfort in a way, because it isn't all that impressive in a game that doesn't fight back that much to just be powerful and annihilate enemies, but it's comfortable. Does it really make you feel powerful? Powerful would be overcoming something challenging, but that's not what a lot of these games are. Power fantasy experiences are usually more comfortable. And by the way, there is obviously no pejorative here. That's good. It's maybe not great that people don't know that that is the case or think of it that way, and think of it in maybe a more toxic or my genitals are more powerful than yours kind of way. But it's not bad to want something comfortable. That's great. It would be maybe better if people thought of it as being useful because it's comfortable. I think that it's coming from a place of the knowledge feeling powerful, the knowledge that this weapon is effective for me and will get the job done. That feels powerful. And when something is taken away, there's other powerful things in the game. Oftentimes the thing is actually still powerful, but what's been taken away from the player that hurts is that they now lost their knowledge that that thing was really powerful is gone. It isn't quite as powerful before. It might be a player that cares way too much about the metagame perception of a thing, and now they don't have the keyword or the passcode to the community to be able to be in the know and have confidence to say, I won't be embarrassed in my social environment because I know that this weapon is really powerful. But now they don't know which weapon is considered to be really powerful, and it doesn't actually have to do with the weapon. And there's also going to be other people for whom it is the weapon. They wanted to feel like they had something they could convince themselves is the most powerful, the pinnacle thing. Again, none of this is inherently necessarily bad. I just think it would be better if people knew that that was what they were insecure about. It's okay to be insecure about those things. It's okay to want comfort. It's okay to feel socially awkward. It's maybe less good if you warp the game and insult the developers because you don't know that those hangups are there. Maybe you didn't think this parlay was going to go this way, but I personally think that that is a big element, is that the player, some types of players, might not even know or think they want, but in practice effectively want there to be things that are bad, because then they can feel like they know the thing that is good. And there's a lot of perfectly valid, but maybe not the most secure reasons why people might feel good about that. I wish people would eventually just embrace the fun of not exactly knowing and finding out. But it is uncomfortable. I admit to plenty of anxiety about not knowing, because it isn't really knowable. It isn't useful to know, which things are the most powerful, because they kind of don't exist. That does cause me some anxiety when I stream. I'm not trying to say that people who care about that thing are just doing it because they want to feel superior to people or whatever. No, it's a form of insecurity that I completely viscerally relate to. So anyway, but it's not real. That's my point. It's a personal hang up that we should respect, but not treat as a thing that is true about the game in some powerful way. Generally, it isn't 100% necessary for the game's items to be sorted into the very most powerful and a little less powerful, but like pretty much the same power level. Usually games that give you these options are designed in a way where lots of them will work. So while I'm not suggesting that there aren't dramatically stronger weapons in, for example, Warframe, there are weapons that are way stronger than others. I'm just saying it's not a huge deal the way people make it out to be. I think the reason it feels like a huge deal to them is something more personal. Speaking of something more personal, yeah, I don't have a lot of examples of me finding, at the end of the parlay, Pingers, you said, I'd be interested to hear about some useless game pieces you've come across, or times you might have been uncertain why something was around, to later find out a good reason to use it. Yeah, I mean, because I have been doing this for so long, because I've lived my life obsessed with making builds, again, I've had that kind of one with nothing experience a lot. When I open a card like that in a pack, I think, all right, developers, like, I see you. This is obviously good in some weird, obscure way that I don't know about. And so I pretty much never open a game piece and think, wow, this is just terrible right away. I reflexively, I'm very proud to say, have come to think reflexively, automatically, oh, this is probably good somewhere and I just don't know. And it takes a lot of convincing for me, sometimes an amount of convincing that frustrates other people, to realize that sometimes it is just bad. The game developers are not perfect. Sometimes it just isn't good game design and the thing just is kind of underpowered. Sometimes I think the game developers are wrong, but it is a perfectly understandable mistake. There are a few cards in Genshin Impact's trading card game that I personally think are not good, but I don't think the developers did something very stupid in making them that way. For a long time playing that game, I looked at those cards and thought, this might be kind of good, or maybe there's a place where this is really, really good. In fact, a few of them, I think that. But you can feel that the developers balance it that way, thinking this might be overpowered. Maybe we should just kind of chill a bit with this one, right? And I don't think that's a bad decision, provided that they follow up. I think that iPatch Notes earlier hit it on the head with the comment on the thread on this parlay. The kicker is that the developer has to iterate for that stuff to be okay. If things are going to be badly designed, but they buff them later, it's all good. But without that loop of things getting buffed a lot, yeah, I don't know if that's so great. Again, what I would prefer is having developers that, yeah, maybe a little bit undershoot the power level of newer things. New things in competitive games get a little advantage because people aren't as familiar with them. It shouldn't be necessary to make the thing super overpowered like they do in some games we won't mention here that are very popular that you might be able to think of that are a 5v5, multiplayer online battle arena kind of thing. You know that game? Where they make characters really OP when they first come out, because it sells a lot of that character. People feel like they have to get the new character immediately because they kind of do, because the character is made purposefully to be better than the other characters at the beginning. Like, that's obviously very bad, and it's obvious why people do it. But in reality, it might be better to make the newer things a little weaker on balance. One reason is because you can buff them later, and players like buffs for whatever misguided reason. It can be fun for things to be buffed. Two, because it's better if the game, which was in a good balance state, stays that way and we get a new option that maybe just needs a little help. The developers, the players can understand it better. And three, because a lot of the time a new option is new design space. That thing might be the only game in town for that type of function, right? A new weapon comes out that has a new ability or a new stat that other weapons don't. That weapon being the only weapon that has it means it gets a little power boost, even though it maybe isn't as powerful in terms of raw effectiveness, which should compensate in a well-designed and calibrated game for any weakness initially. So yeah, all of that preamble just to say I have tried very hard, and I think have mostly achieved reflexively assuming that things are good or there's a reason they're not great. And developers, the only way you really lose my faith in that is if you don't iterate on things, if you don't go back and change things afterward. I am willing to be patient, but you got to go back and change stuff. It means a lot to people who really like that thing. It doesn't have a clear, tangible benefit. They might not even know it was changed in some cases, but it will have an effect. The game being truly good does have an effect on the players, even though it also matters that they think it's good, of course. So yeah, sure. I mean, I can think of a few specific examples. I remember when Innistrad came out in Magic the Gathering. And Innistrad is this kind of horror, I would really word it as kind of a Halloween-themed plane, but like a gothic horror or gothic trope-themed plane, with a tribal theme. And Magic usually means creatures that, or cards that support creatures of one type. So there was werewolves and vampires and zombies. Zombies had a little bit of new design space, where while they were normally black, some Innistrad zombies were blue, to invoke the flavor of blue, the color of knowledge, being like Frankenstein's monster kind of zombies. Zombies that are created with science rather than just resurrected, stitched together by that type of necromancer. So that was a cool new design space for zombies. I have a very fond memory of that. Spirits also, pretty underserved tribe in Magic, but the werewolf thing was cool. We got double-sided cards when the human transforms into a werewolf. And then humans as a tribe, but then some of the other tribes also have some humans. The people making the zombies, the human forms of the werewolves are still humans. And so there was that human tribe. It was really cool. I've got a lot of fond memories of Innistrad. But I specifically remember thinking that Thought Scour was not like crazy powerful. And in a similar meta very soon before that, recently before that, the Gitaxian Probe wasn't like really broken. Gitaxian Probe lets you pay 2 life instead of a mana for it, so you don't have to pay any mana, which doesn't slow down your game plan in Magic. And you get to look at your opponent's hand and draw a card. So remember, it's a card, so it just replaces itself, and you look at their hand. That's it. That's it, though? I mean, the card is cracked. Like, there's really no reason not to just get perfect information in your opponent's hand, make the game of Magic the Gathering way less interesting, change it from Wizard Poker to the Wizard Solitaire, and you lose 2 life. Pish posh. Like, what? Have you played a game of Magic that was lost by 2 life recently? I mean, they happen. They absolutely happen, don't get me wrong. But if your opponent's playing it too, probably not, right? It makes your deck 4 cards smaller in Constructed and gives you more games than not perfect information about your opponent's hand for pretty much no cost. And you can play it in basically any deck. It is pretty messed up, but at the time, we weren't playing it in every single deck. Maybe for some reason that was more right than I remember it being wrong, but looking back, it's like, no, that card was pretty messed up. Why didn't we just play that in every single strategy? That's weird. I don't know why I didn't think it was bad. Nobody thought it was bad. Everybody thought Phyrexian Mana was really good. But what the heck were we thinking, not putting that in like every deck under the sun? I don't know. I mean, it's debatable that if the game is more of a slugfest and a slower format, I don't know. Yeah, I guess we were too worried about the 2 life. That's really embarrassing. People liked Dismember, which you could pay 1 mana and 4 life for the double black Phyrexian Mana, and then give a creature -5/-5. So basically get a great kill spell in any color, even the colors that normally don't have that, for 1 mana. But but 4 life. And people understood that just like how life gain spells are bad, this is good, because even though you lose a bunch of life, you remove the source of you losing even more life, that's good. It's good for the reason life gain spells are bad. So we all knew that was good. What the heck was our problem with Gitaxian Probe? We played Gutshot a lot. I mean, Gutshot is great, of course. Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember. I remember thinking in the Genshin Impact TCG that Animo Resonance was kind of bad. So Genshin Impact TCG, you get 3 characters, and they each have an element, primary element. The thing about Genshin Impact and the Genshin Impact TCG is it's very heavily focused on reactions. If you combine 2 elements that combine in a powerful way, you get a lot of damage, like tons of damage. Most of the damage there is to be had in these games is from reactions. Not absolutely all of it, but almost all of it. So Animo spreads other elements. It doesn't in itself do a ton of damage, but it's very good at setting up other elements. It's not terrible at doing a good amount of damage, but... So I'd thought 2 Animo characters, and then you have to have only 1 other element character, and then you can't do big bongo damage reactions. That's terrible, I thought to myself. But of course, there's some way it's going to be good. The effect is really good. When you play 2 characters of the same element or more, you get to play a few unique cards that are pretty powerful in exchange. And the unique Animo Resonance one gives you the ability to swap characters for basically no cost. You have to pay 1 die, but then you get it back as an Omni die. So it fixes your mana a little bit, and you get to quick swap for, again, effectively no cost. It's very good, like a very useful card that lets you move around your characters a lot. But being able to swap to a different character to combo elements together seemed to me to be bad, like for the reason it would have been good. Like you can only play the card if the way it would be good isn't applicable, right? You would be able to use it to quickly combo 2 elements, but you can't do that because you have to use 2 Animo characters, which means you don't have 2 elements. That is the most common place where I as a player get caught, and I try to be lazy and say, it's just bad. Developers, I've got you. This could be really powerful, so you balanced it by putting it in this scenario, but that scenario makes it always categorically bad, which is not true at all, by the way. If you play Genshin Impact TCG, try Jean, Magukenki, and Oceanid with the card that summons a random Hilichurl shooter. Magukenki counts as Animo, but can play a Cryo ability, and then the Hilichurl shooters, you get Cryo, Hydro, Electro, or Pyro at random. So in practice, you do have 2 elements. You have Cryo and Hydro from the Oceanid, and you've got 2 monster-type enemies, so you can play that Hilichurl card, which will give you splashes of other elements from time to time. And you can still play the Animo Resonance cards. Magukenki even has a talent card that lets you swap characters even more freely. And then you play When the Crane Returned, you're living large. You could just play random spells, and as you do your attacks, you also swap characters. It's a masterpiece, like so good. It's so much fun. You could just freely fly through all your units. It's great. But yeah, that was another success story for me where Gitaxian Probe, a card, went on to be this monster in competitive formats that ended up getting banned. It's kind of embarrassing to have a card like that get banned, but it's kind of embarrassing that they made a card like that. So go figure. And the Animo Resonance thing was just a really happy surprise. It was an example of where I, a person who's really practiced, not falling into the trap of assuming the thing will be bad, kind of assumed the thing would be bad. And to be fair, I don't think that's terrible reasoning, but of course there's going to be an exception. Like, they've thought of that, you know? The Genshin Impact TCG is well designed. Like, they've thought that far. Generally, I feel like if you have a reaction to a card immediately, and the game wasn't made by one guy, they've thought of that objection you had. They showed it to enough of a maybe small playtest group that someone had that reaction you had. You are not a genius. I am not a genius. No one has an amazing instantaneous take on a card that no one else has had before. They have thought of that. If they put the effort into balancing the game, they either balanced that or they just didn't care and didn't balance it, right? We say in Magic a lot of the time, many of the most broken cards, they knew it was broken. They put it in to sell more packs. No one didn't know it was broken. That's not really possible. But I think some cards like Gitaxian Probe were a mistake because their problems are more practical. Again, they kind of just make Magic a bit more boring. It's not that they're so overpowered, and you could argue that that trade-off of paying a bit of life most matches to get some information, well, it's good for decks that don't care if you have that information and are going to be more aggressive. Like, you could argue it has a, theoretically, it could be positive metagame impact. It just didn't. So to be fair to them, I feel like Gitaxian Probe was an honest mistake. Phyrexian Mana maybe wasn't. But there's lots of recent cards like Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, and Oko, Thief of Crowns. Oko, Thief of Crowns, where they all but admitted that they made the card OP on purpose late in development after they'd play tested it, and then didn't play test with the overpowered version to sell more packs, like, basically. So for what it's worth, in the very rare case that a thing is really overpowered, I personally believe that the developers know, and I kind of feel like that's true for things that are underpowered. For these useless game pieces, I try to suggest a few reasons why the developer might do that on purpose. I think that they are inferior game design to ways of developing a game that don't require doing such a thing, but I think that most of the time, the developer knows that the thing isn't that powerful, and there's just some reason why they left it there or did it that way anyway, rather than that they just don't know. I think it's very uncommon for the developer to not know. To be blunt, it's usually pretty obvious. So yeah, this was a really fun one. I had, more examples that I was excited to talk about than I thought I would, but for games other than card games, there was a lot of card games in this one. Go figure, go fish.